From KALW's The Spiritual Edge, this is Sacred Steps, taking you around the world to meet some remarkable people as they lean on their values and faith to challenge the status quo. I'm Judy Silber. My husband and I got COVID-19 in mid-October of 2020. It was scary. We cycled through symptoms that changed daily. A terrible cough and exhaustion for my husband. For me, fever, nausea, and later a strange tingling in my nerves. The hardest part was not knowing if we'd take a turn for the worse. Every few days, we'd get a call from our healthcare provider, checking in. The nurses couldn't answer every question, but I still felt so grateful for their calls. It just felt good to know that someone cared. Medical workers are among the heroes of this pandemic. They've endured strain and heartbreak, and the trauma of that will likely remain with them for a long time. I know the events of the pandemic won't easily fade for me either. So for our new series, Sacred Steps, we wanted to begin with a tribute, a profile of a hospital chaplain in Boston. Her name is Sarah Byrne-Martelli, and during the worst of 2020, she was the last person many COVID patients saw as they approached the end of their lives. Here's reporter Heidi Shin.
Sarah remembers her first day back at work, the feeling of the N95 mask suctioned to her face like a vacuum.
And when you put the N95 on, there's this kind of metal piece over your nose, and you're supposed to push it, and she said, push it through to the back of your skull for 10 seconds, really hard.
Then comes the face mask and the spritz test. It's a sugar spray.
Like if they're like blowing air into you, like if like those bags that when you're trying to help someone breathe, it's like that. They go like, shh. And then they have you read this poem out loud that they hold up.
Does the mask fit tight enough? That's what they were trying to see. Sarah works at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. It's a Harvard teaching hospital. Patients used to fly in from all over the world to see doctors here, but now local COVID cases have taken over the wards. Sarah remembers waiting to start work for the day in the palliative care unit. It's where she works with patients who are facing the end of their lives.
It's like, I feel like I'm in the movie E.T. or something, at the end with all like the equipment and the white suits and everything. I feel like they must feel like they're in some sort of weird sci-fi experience.
It was the spring of 2020, the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in Boston. The death toll was rising, and the city was under lockdown for the first time. Ambulance sirens became the Civic soundtrack. People stressed about where and how to get their groceries. They applauded frontline workers from their balconies at 8 o'clock every night. Sarah Byrne-Martelli is one of those frontline workers at Mass General. She's not a physician or a medical worker, though. She's a chaplain in palliative care, the person who sits with you and prays with you in your last days of life. Now, Sarah is not who you might picture. No stiff robes. She favors skirts and dresses and black patent leather clogs, the kind you see doctors and nurses wear because they're on their feet all day. Her hair is in what she calls a permanent messy ponytail. She's not Catholic, though that's what most of her patients think. She's Eastern Orthodox, kind of a trailblazer in her church, actually. The first woman chaplain in her denomination ever.
Like I have these ridiculous pictures of me with like all very, very bearded Orthodox priests. It's like one of these things is not like the other.
And was that hard?
Yes, it was.
Since then, other women have followed. Sarah's mentored them. And 18 years later, I feel like it's this kind of willingness to dive in. It helps Sarah in her work as a chaplain. Now, let me share with you what a typical day would look like for Sarah before COVID. Hospital life was pretty frenetic. There would have been a flurry of doctors and nurses trying to figure out what else they could do for a patient who's dying. Meanwhile, their families are wondering, is it okay to take somebody that I love off a respirator so their life would end? Or does this mean that we're trying to play God? And this is when the medical staff calls for Sarah, the chaplain.
And the thing is, for me, I hope that too, right? Always. And I also know that sometimes miracles don't happen in the time frame or in the way that we want.
And before COVID, one of Sarah's most surprising roles was this one. She'd get families who've been fighting to start talking again. She's the kind of person who can get you to open up, like someone you've known for a long time, even though you just met. She's steadfast, warm, and even the medical teams in the ICU say she's surprisingly funny.
I kind of made a joke to the medical, like the MICU attending, like, I'll just start praying so they can't start arguing with each other.
She'll help people tell stories. Sometimes she'll even give them hugs. She'll whisper in a patient's ear as their breathing starts to slow. She's a human touch in a sea of machines and procedures that sustain someone at the end of their life. Once the pandemic hit, things looked different. When the hospital sent Sarah to work from home, she placed iPads by her patients' bedsides and cared for them by phone. But there's only so much she could do from a distance. After a few weeks, she went back into the hospital to see patients again in person. By then, the hospital had become a battleground with focused intensity. Mass General closed its coffee shops and restricted visitors. COVID patients had taken over, and many were dying alone. Sarah tells me about the first COVID patient she saw in person. He was a man in his 70s.
And so I went in and saw him, and he had a trach, so a breathing tube in his neck to breathe. He still needed the help of a ventilator. And he had protective mitts on his hands. They're kind of like these pillow things like that you put around your whole hand, which meant that he had at some point must have tried to pull out his tubes because you get delirious when you're in the ICU. You know, when I introduced myself, he turned his head and looked right at me. He would nod a little bit. He would cough a lot. And, being a human myself and being new to the COVID experience, it was a little scary every time he would cough because then I would wonder, am I too close to him? I was worried because my glasses started to fog up, and then I thought, okay, are they supposed to fog up?
She pauses. She's not sure what to do. Is her mask working?
I don't know, but now it's too late because I'm in here, so I'm going to just try to, I'm going to just do my best. And he couldn't speak. And so, the question is, how do you help someone who's grieve when they can't speak? And he looked so sad. And, I introduced myself. I wasn't sure if he really comprehended who I was.
He had just lost his wife to COVID. They'd been admitted together. He just learned of her death, but he couldn't see her. He was on a respirator and isolated. Doctors and nurses didn't know what else they could do for him, so they sent Sarah in. She knew the man was a Christian, so Sarah found some Psalms to read for him.
Psalm 88. O Lord God of my salvation, when at night I cry out in your presence, let my prayer come before you, incline your ear to my cry. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like those who have no help, like those forsaken among the dead.
And so I read some of those, hoping that would be comforting and maybe familiar words to him if that was something he did in the past. And prayed with him. And I felt helpless. I felt like I didn't know if what I did made a difference. I will never know. And it's important to be okay with that not knowing. In moments like that, the most important thing you can do is just be quiet, be reverent, respectful, not fill in the space with just like chatter, but to really just try to honor what's going on. And that's important.
Yeah. Does death scare you, having seen so much of it?
No. I mean, what scares me is people who are in really bad pain or people who are alone, people who don't have support. That definitely scares me.
To be alone at the end of life, to be without people who care for you, who love you. During the time of COVID, this happened to so many. Families grieving over Zoom, friends offering condolences on Facebook. Meanwhile, Sarah is there in person to ensure that no one dies alone.